So good morning to everyone here in the room. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining online. We have several people joining online from all parts of the world. Thank you for your interest in this UNESCO Chair Lecture today, and thanks for joining us. Maybe for those of you who are joining for the first time, we have some brief information on this lecture series. My name is Daniel Fischer. I'm the UNESCO Chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Higher Education for Sustainable Development here at Leuphana University. For those of you who don't know about Leuphana University, it's in the north of Germany, just south of Hamburg. And as a UNESCO Chair, we are focusing on higher education for sustainable development, and we are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. So it's also a festive year for us here. We are running this. We are running not just the UNESCO Chair, we are also part of the UniTwin network, which is even a broader entity, you could say, of several UNESCO chairs and other research chairs collaborating on a dedicated theme. So we are part of the UniTwin network on education for sustainable development and social transformation, which is the first UniTwin network really dedicated to education for sustainable development. And we are one of the founding partners, and we have with Heila Lotz-Sisitka, a representative of another founding member from Rhodes University in South Africa, here with us today. Yes, and it's my pleasure to introduce Heila, and I thought I'd maybe have, if you allow me, just one short introductory comment. I think we are seeing an increasing level of implementation and efforts of implementing ESD across the world, which is something that we've worked for and towards for a very long time. So this is a very good thing to see that ESD is gaining traction, it's getting more recognition, it's moving more to the center of education. But I'm also always reminded of something that I think David Orr once wrote, that he said it's not more of the same education that will save us, it's a radically different kind of education. And I think today's talk in our UNESCO Chair Lecture Series is going to unpack a bit what that other radically different type of education might mean, and how we can go beyond just an individual focus and a cognitive focus in education for sustainable development. And with these short remarks, I would like to warmly welcome to campus and to this UNESCO Chair Lecture Series our guest, Heila Lotz-Sisitka. She's So I'm moving the computer so that you can also see Heila here. There you are.
You know our cameras, right? Yeah.
Exactly, yes. So Heila holds the South African Research Chair Initiative, SACHI Chair in Global Change and Social Learning Systems. She still is, and she has been for a very long time, the director of the Environmental Learning Research Center at Rhodes University in South Africa. And her work focuses on transformative education, social learning, and just sustainability transitions, among other fields that you're interested in and you're an expert in. We have had the pleasure to work with Heila. We do have the pleasure to work with her and her team members and collaborators from 10 other universities in sub-Saharan Africa in a current Erasmus Plus project, which is focused on building the capacity of educators to implement curriculum innovations in a very bottom-up collaborative way. And I think, we can build in this project on a long experience with collaborative, co-creative approaches that Heila has worked on with her team and her collaborators over the past decades, I would say. And we are very, I think it's a great honor for us to hear from your experience and benefit a bit from it. And with that, I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
And good morning to everybody in the room and everybody online. We were just joking that, the ones in the room get biscuits. If you're online, I'm afraid there's no biscuits. But it's good to see so many people online and also to be in the room. So with Hybrid Life, I'm going to sit here. I would normally be standing and talking to everybody in the room, but with Hybrid Life, I'm just going to sit here because it's easier just to manage everything and also not lose everybody who's online. So thank you firstly for having me here again. It's my, I think, second or third visit to Leuphana. And always lovely to be here in this beautiful building. It's a incredibly imaginative building, and I think sets the tone actually for thinking differently about what education could and should be doing, which is to create different ways of thinking and being for people and on the planet at this time in our history. So my talk is a bit provocative. It's a serious provocation, actually. And I just called it de-individualizing learning because I thought, if you say something like that, it can help you to think into what that could look like. Of course, we always learn as individuals, but there are other ways of learning. And it's that which I really want to open up today, to not say that we don't learn as individuals. We do, of course, but that's the dominant mode in education. So how can we maybe shift that a little bit? So that's really what I wanted to speak about. My presentation starts with a few opening thoughts. It kind of speaks a little bit to the crisis and the idea of the crisis that we're in. It opens up a paradox, and then a problem, and then a challenge, and then an opportunity, and then a reflection. Then I will share with you my killer slide. I think Daniel will remember when I got a prize for the killer slide. I've been working on that slide for 20 years, and it's such an interesting slide because it keeps changing, actually. Then I'm going to talk about a conundrum, and then I'm going to have an open question for us. I'm going to share a resource, something that we found very helpful in terms of the work we're doing, some examples, open up a little bit of our imagination, and then kind of move towards closure with some lessons, some insights, and some guidance. And of course, leave you with an ongoing challenge. And I'll leave you with a reference as well. I don't often do my references, but I'll leave you with one reference today. Okay, so I think just to start with, I think we all know more or less why we're here, is that, what's happening here now? That we are, sitting in quite a conundrum crisis. People call it the polycrisis. And it is, I guess, the state of our planet. And it's quite a complex situation that we're in, because we're dealing here with the sort of geohistorical genesis, which is the way in which the planet and its Earth system changes. And then we also have the sociocultural genesis, which is the way us and our cultures are transforming. And so when we're talking about this kind of work, we're really talking about how the natural, historical, cultural starts to constitute a much larger presence in human affairs, with the natural becoming ever more penetrated in our way of thinking about the human and the cultural. And we find a number of disjunctures, actually, that play out at the borders of these constructs of our society and the realities, actually, of being human on a changing planet. And so issues of crisis, agency, and justice begin to intersect, and they should really be brought into focus in and through co-engaged research, action, or increasingly people are calling them world-making actions, and learning in transformations to sustainability. So we're seeing a lot of changes in the way people are doing research. I think this university, with Daniel and the team, have been at the forefront of transdisciplinary research, which is doing exactly this kind of thing. And then, of course, also in the educational sciences, which is where I come from and where Daniel also comes from. But we're at this intersecting interface. So this is the kind of thing that we see when we talk about polycrisis. There's just, so much happening, and it's the world that has been made, okay? And it is the world that is being left for current and future generations. So we see, failure of wastewater treatment plants there, people not having adequate housing, climate change impacts, unemployment, precarity, increasing violence, and all sorts of things which really put a lot of sort of stress on us and try to make us think about, well, how can the world be, how should the world be different, and what kind of learning agency and world making are we witnessing when we see these kinds of issues? Because these are created by people, right? So they can actually be changed by people. So what might we need instead? And one of the things that we have is we have a legacy of education system that tests our knowledge, develops our knowledge, tells us about the problems, and then it leaves us, I think, often without the right kind of agency that we need in order to be able to act in the world. And one of the things we're seeing is increased levels of protest. And this seems to be one of the forms of action that people feel that they can reach for in such struggles, but of course it's not really adequate enough for rebuilding the world. It's very important for raising politics and the issues that need to be focused on. But how do we take the responses further from there? And that's where I think that learning is really important, and how we think about learning. Of course, young people have been, calling for system change and climate change, and much more conscious of these kinds of challenges in our society today. And so what needs to change in education is the big question. And also, how do we approach learning in education? And I think that this question has not been discussed enough. People talk a lot about the change in education at a very broad level, but the way we think about learning hasn't been discussed well enough in education. I'm very happy to say that it's hitting the top of the pops now, and we're seeing policy in UNESCO discourse. For example, this one, it's my favorite quote from UNESCO, which says that transformative learning for people and planet is a necessity for our survival and that of future generations. The time to learn and act for our planet is now. So they name transformative learning, but again, it's not well articulated in the languages of learning and in the ways in which learning is being framed, even in follow-on policy documentation from this. So this is an interesting challenge for us in the learning sciences and in education. And I have been doing a lot of thinking together with my research group for the last 15, 20 or more years, in fact, about how such learning should be constituted, how we research that learning, how it should be constituted, how we should assess it, what it actually means for classrooms, for schools, for TVET colleges, for learning in public spaces, for interdisciplinary engagements and learning, and so on. So what does this learning actually look like, and how should it be constituted? So I like this piece, from the Tchaikovsky and Leontief, who have warned us that through abstraction of concerns such as crisis, the learner can be removed from the real process of life, the interaction that is his or her real existence. So we have to be very careful that we don't produce crisis in such a way that it doesn't connect with the life world of people and their experience of the world. So this is a challenge for teachers, right? And it's shown itself to be a challenge in education, because we've also been educating young people to be scared of the future, and in some cases even depressed, and in some cases young people are even suicidal. They don't know how to act, okay, because of the way that they're coming to these issues and the sort of grasping of the content. And so there's a big challenge for us as educators to resolve this. So what Leontief says is that the relationship between a person and the environment is defined not by the environment and not by abstract properties of his or her personality, but specifically by the content of his or her activity and by the level of development of this activity. So if we start to think about activity and the way in which activity is what actually binds us as human beings to our environments, we can begin to find a place to actually work on these kinds of issues. So every environmental justice problem is a human problem that needs transformative, transgressive, co-learning and transformation of shared activity. I showed you the wastewater treatment plants in South Africa that are in failure. Well, the activity that we're working on there, my lecture is here in the back there, is working with young people to monitor the rivers and try to, inform the governance system of the levels of pollution in the rivers, and to try to help them to better monitor the effluents that are running into our rivers. So the activity around which people can start to work and learn together. So there's another, here's the paradox, which I find a fascinating paradox, actually. I came across it in an article, but we come across it more often, where people are saying that, we've got such urgent issues that need to be dealt with quite quickly. So the assessments are that the rates of change between fast, non-linear environmental changes and the accompanying social changes are out of sync. So in short, what they're saying is that the cultural changes are not keeping up with the scale and scope of the environmental changes, right? So we're out of sync with the way in which the planetary system is changing. And we can see that with all the discourse around 1.5 degrees, and we're not able to, keep ourselves below 1.5 degrees. we're out of sync, right? The socio-cultural system is out of sync with the way in which we've affected the Earth system. And people are saying that we need cultural and value changes, quite significant ones, and they have to occur within a generation rather than over generations, and that this has to happen via new ways of learning, through advancing new ways of learning. And again, it's not said what kinds of learning, okay, or how to advance these ways of learning. And then there's this point that this is very problematic because we don't have the time to do it because it takes time to work with people to make these cultural changes. So it's like a real paradox, isn't it? It's a kind of a real complex thing. So in fact, it's a collective learning paradox if you read into it. Basically saying that we don't have the capacity to do the kind of collective learning that we need in order to resolve this problem of being out of sync. Now, I just think that that's nonsense, actually. We do have the capacity, but we have to develop it, okay? We have to do it probably quicker than we're thinking we should. So it's not really a failure to advance new ways of learning that take different stakeholder views into account, but maybe it's just a failure in the way that we are working on questions of learning. So that's a little bit, I guess, what I'm trying to raise here. So then this challenge that I'm bringing to us today in the talk is to share some of the research that we've been doing on collective learning-based, learning-centered, community-based transformations and change-orientated teachers, professional development programs in Southern Africa, where we've been trying to move beyond models of learning that's focused on individualized cognitive gains as a core logic of our T-learning activity. So we try to think about the core logic not being only individualized cognitive gain. Of course, people do gain cognitively through all these activities, but really what is the broader focus for the shared learning activities. And so in some ways, it then challenges this dominance of individualized cognitive gain as the main outcome for education. And we only have to look at the issues such as the PISA tests and the power that things like the PISA tests have to show the power that this model of individualized cognitive gain has on education and the way in which it's captured all of our teachers. And our teachers feel stressed by it all over the world, okay? Not only in Germany. I know they're stressed about it in Germany. They're also stressed about it in Sweden. They're stressed about it in South Africa. They really are stressed about it all over the world. So what are we doing? You know, we're producing stress in our education system around a model of learning, which is maybe not going to be adequate for challenges that we are dealing with in our times. So a big challenge. So what's the opportunity? So the opportunity is that we are seeing what I would say more progressive policy at the international level. This is a UNESCO Unitary Network, UNESCO Chair, and I've also worked quite a lot with UNESCO and really been thinking a lot about the role that they can play in helping countries to think beyond the limited norm. So there's been quite a bit of this kind of policy coming through, trying to broaden the focus of education, especially recently they've said it's not only about cognition, it's also about social emotional, it's also about behavior. I don't like that top term. I come from a behaviorist education system in South Africa, so I don't like the emphasis on behavior. I prefer action, because action is a more social concept. So every time I see UNESCO, I tell them that. But essentially what we're seeing is efforts to try to, frame a qualitatively different kind of education and also to support education system transformation. And this Futures of Education report that came out recently is a very good read, actually, and it was a big global process involving millions of people. And what this document does is it starts to articulate a new social contract for education. It starts to articulate a new purpose for education. And with a new purpose, new relationality in the education system. And here's some of the quotes from it. So it says, a new social contract for education must unite us around collective endeavors and provide knowledge and innovation needed to shape sustainable and peaceful futures for all, anchored in social, economic, and environmental justice. Imagine that as a purpose for education. It's a huge change from what we had before. Purpose of education before was to produce the human capital needed for industrialization and colonization. That's what the purpose of education was before. It is no longer the purpose of education. So with that, we got this massive shift. But the massive shift needs to be understood and perceived by all of us. And then it says, at present, the ways we organize education across the world do not do enough to ensure just and peaceful societies, a healthy planet, and shared progress that benefits all. In fact, some of our difficulties stem from how we educate. And the new social contract for education needs to allow us to think differently about learning and the relationships between students, teachers, knowledge, and the world. So there's the opening, right? So nice to always have a policy opening. It kind of gives you like, oh, now I can breathe and get on with what I'm doing, you know? And you feel, yes, okay, it is actually happening. It's not just you. There is actually a bigger movement into which this work can find its place. Very good for PhD students. If I was a PhD student, I would have been so excited now because, wow, look at this opening, you see, for all kinds of new research in education. Here's the statements, the proposals that the social contract makes for pedagogy. And it says here, pedagogy should be organized around the principles of cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity. Isn't that very different to what we had before? So very interesting. Then it goes on to talk about curriculum, and the curriculum needs to also reshape itself. The teaching needs to reshape itself. The schools need to reshape themselves. And the whole notion of education and education opportunities need to reshape themselves. So it's a very interesting, what I would call anchor document that we have in our midst at the moment coming from UNESCO. And they have, of course, turned it now into a recommendation, which means it's a much more strategic policy that all of our countries actually report against. So this recommendation on education for peace and human rights, international cooperation, fundamental freedoms, global citizenship, and sustainable development. It's got a shorter name, but essentially that's what it is. It's basically a recommendation on how to drive and support transformative education in contemporary times. And it was updated from one that was developed 50 years ago. Very interesting process because the discourse actually changed so much in the 50 years, right? But the need for this kind of transformative education hasn't actually changed. In fact, it's amplified. So if you compare the earlier document and this document, you can see, you know, the shifts that have occurred in our language and our sensibilities. For example, there was nothing on environmental climate change in there. The gender issues were almost absent, strangely enough, and so on, you know. But now, of course, we've been able to bring more of them in, but still constrained, right? Because UNESCO works with, mighty or no, adopted language, okay? So you can only work with language that's already been adopted by the government. You can't introduce radical new language. So, for example, I couldn't introduce transgressive learning into that's not adopted language. But at least as an academic, you can keep working with it, right? Keep pushing the front. And then here's some of the pieces from this recommendation, which in a way begin to sort of concretize some of what was said earlier. It's a little bit more conservative, this document, than the futures document. You can understand that as it goes through all these, you know, governmental argumentations for months and so on. It gets kind of honed down to more and more adopted language and the politics that exists between countries and so on. But nevertheless, some of this collaborative, more complex, integrative orientations to education and learning have remained and are in this recommendation. So I won't go through them all, but there's one on climate change education, and it talks about empowering learners to act as agents of change, which we've never had in an education policy of this nature before. It also talks about these collaborative pedagogical approaches, footpath integration. It talks about supporting opportunities for collaboration among all educational and other relevant stakeholders. And it talks there, including your knowledge bearers in your communities, Indigenous people, their heritage, artists, cultural professionals, parents, caregivers. So it opens the educational space actually for this kind of more collaborative way of thinking about education and learning. And then in terms of assessment, it talks about the need to strengthen collaboration, assessment that strengthens collaboration, cooperation, and mutual understanding. That is a radical shift, a very radical shift. I think that very few people have started to internalize what this actually means, but it is actually a very radical shift. It moves right away from the PISA model to a much more kind of, I would say, human, cooperative-centered kind of model of assessment. So interesting from a policy perspective. So now I'm going to move on to reflection and just ask, well, what can we learn from 200 plus years of learning sciences, right, for this moment in our time? And here comes the killer slide. I love this killer slide. David told me I should write a book on the killer slide, which I will still do, actually. But essentially what I was doing here was to just look at the changes in society over time. At the top there you can see. And then the changes in ways of thinking about human learning. Okay, and those of course come with the emergence of disciplines like psychology and so on and their early establishment following the methodology of the natural sciences. So they were extremely positivist. And so we got behaviorist models of education driven through the Pavlov and Skinner kind of logics, which is why I don't like the return to behavior in the UNESCO documentation. And quite technocratic and instrumentalist views of learning from that. And then, of course, the emergence of the cognitive sciences, Piaget, and so on, and beginning to say, well, actually, people are not just, responding to stimuli, they actually do have brains and minds, and there's a whole lot that goes on inside them, and they internalize things from the outside, and so on and so on. And so that's that whole like cognitive revolution in the learning sciences, and then that same revolution becoming more social and socio-cultural, with further research, right, in the learning sciences. So, and then also becoming more critical as we got, the advances of democracy, feminism, post-colonial independence, and so on. So you see these kind of movements in society and the shifts in the learning sciences. And then a focus on things like participation in education praxis with Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire, by the way, had a meeting with Julius Nyerere, I discovered the other day, which is very interesting for decolonial education. And then in the very recent period of the learning sciences, we've got a burgeoning, I would say, of sociocultural psychology and sociocultural learning theory, which is looking at the relationship between learning, but in its social space and that kind of relationality, and there's all kinds of theorists there. Ingerstrom, who I work with a lot, I really like the work that he's doing because it's collective and it centers around the transformation of human activity and gives us good methodologies and ways of thinking about that work. And then there's others, Levin Wenger, Barbara Rogoff, and so on. So quite a lot of work emerging here, focusing on learning and agency for change and bringing the relationship between learning and agency together in the education sphere, which is very important for driving the kinds of transformations that we are looking to. And of course, we've got something new happening on the scene now, which is coming incredibly fast, and which also, I think, very uncritically dealt with in the education sphere. Techno-feudalism is what I call it. And if you read around a bit around that concept, you'll see we are all stuck with it now, actually. And we've got artificial intelligence, machine learning, adopting the language of learning, right? It's not intelligent, actually. It's just good patterning, right? It's good pattern analysis, good coding. My nephew does it, right? He tells me, he sits and I can see him working with his coding all day. That's what he does. He's doing artificial intelligence coding. But he says, it's not intelligent, I'm the coder, I'm the one who's, so you're getting conflation of the language of learning into the language of technology, which is dangerous, I think, for the learning sciences. Even concepts like deep learning, machine learning, what do they really mean, in terms of learning. So it's a challenge for us. And then there's an overlap of this with neuroscience. And so we're getting a kind of neuro-individualism emerging, which is driving, by the way, the social and emotional, a lot of the social and emotional learning work. There's a very big confluence between neuroscience and social and emotional learning work. So I think it needs to be connected back into the sociocultural research. I think there's a need for that. And we're also getting a commercialization of all of this. The best one I found was something called brainpop.com. So brainpop.com will supply you with all your learning needs, okay? Because it responds directly to you and your learning need according to the algorithm that it's picked up about you. Can you imagine how dangerous that is? So, but there's a lot of it out there. If you start looking for it, you find a lot. So I think I'm not anti-technology, but I think we need to be more critical about this kind of work, and then also the relationship between this and behavioral economics, which tends to think that you can't think fast enough. Some people can't think fast enough, therefore others must think on their behalf. Now that, I'm sorry, is social engineering. So I think we have to be, much more critical about these things as we look into the world and so on. So the killer slide is there. I like the killer slide because it helps me to see all of the things and then know where I think it's important to stay focused in terms of the kind of research that I'm doing, but still see the rest, okay, and see it in relation to that. And then, of course, this killer slide is not really that helpful, actually, because most of what's on the killer slide is not being developed in the Global South. It's where all the knowledge production has been taking place in the books and on the journals and in the libraries, and that's not where we are living. So De Souza Santos talks about epistemicide, and he talks about how the world's majority people knowledges are just not being counted or taken into account in the production of all of these knowledges, so-called knowledges about the world. So we're sitting with a conundrum, actually, and it's a kind of a conundrum of inclusivity and how to produce that inclusivity that we now need, given that, for example, this is the water challenges on the planet. You can see where most of the world's people are having water challenges and where most of the knowledge is being produced. So you're getting that kind of a conundrum. So I think there's need for us to be very open-minded, actually, in the way that we do this work, and to think about it as sort of a vitality of transformative, transgressive learning that can rise in places that we haven't maybe anticipated before, and in different ways. That's the kind of thing that I think we also been trying to do. So it's really an open question, and we've called it a bit of an open T-learning, transformative learning, transgressive learning, together learning, transdisciplinary, T. Even having tea is a form of learning, right? If you do the Chinese tea ceremony, it's an amazing form of embodied social learning, right? So and play. So we opened this tea as a way to play and a way to be open-minded about the kinds of learning that we might need. So we've made it an open question. And it's really this question, is learning in the Anthropocene the same as learning in the Holocene? What needs to be shifted? What can be different? What does it mean for education? How do we do the research? And so on. So now I'll go into some of the examples and just share with you some of the work we've been doing investigating T-learning. And we've been doing it for a while. We started with a research project that was funded by the International Science Council at the same time that I got my Sochi chair. But the uptake and the response to this research was just so huge that we couldn't stop. So we just continued the research program. When the funding ended, we continued. So we now have probably 40, 50, 60, 70 studies that are all, gifting us knowledge on T-learning and how to think about it. And it's growing rapidly, and I've started to see that it's growing now, not only where we are, but all over the world. People are starting to do T-learning research and then comment on some of the work and so on. So it's really nice and dynamic. So a resource that we've worked a lot with is the Engestrom's project, which is a post-Vygotskian project. And the reason why I really liked it was that it focuses on the transformation of human activity. In other words, it's collective learning, theorizing collective learning. It comes out of cultural psychology, and it comes out of post-Marxism, the 1960s kind of interest in transformation of society. And Engestrom is just a brilliant learning theorist, and he has been developing the project. So it's a living project and moving with the times, I would say. And he recently wrote this book, that this studies in expansive learning is learning what is not yet there. We don't really know what we need to learn, and we need to do it together. And then he also is picking up some of the environment and social justice concerns, working with social movements and so on now in the most recent bodies of work, and we've been contributing to that as well. So he talks about the runaway object, that things are becoming so complex, we don't actually know how to deal with them. And because of that, we actually have to work in these ever more complex, heterogeneous coalitions and learn together how to respond and how to transform activity. So not much different to the intentionalities of transdisciplinarity that Daniel and others have been reading, but it gives us the language of learning in order to do that research. So we reached then for the best that we could find, the best available guidance, and on collective learning, transformative agency, systemic change, boundary crossing, capacity to deal with complexity but not get paralyzed, how to be involved in active future making and world making at all levels across society. And this project actually gives you the theoretical resources for that. So we've been able to work quite well with that. And so we sort of said that this kind of learning involves learning what's not yet there, and it can help to lead development and change in transformations in our shared human activity. And so we've been trying to find and develop the examples and see how this actually works in our context. So here's just very briefly, I'll just touch them up. But there are many examples now of this kind of learning emerging in community contexts, in contexts where communities and TVETs are connecting, in workplaces, in schools, with teacher educators, and so on. So here's one case in TVET that's been going on for probably about 10 years or more, since 2014. And it's an ongoing project which is kind of producing innovation in the TVET system and also support for the farmers to learn how to deal with water shortages, droughts, managing their small-scale production under quite extreme and difficult conditions. So very interesting. You can see all the different activity systems that are involved there, loads of people, lots of stuff going on. There's a WhatsApp group that even this morning people were posting, and they post things that they want to know about, and things that they think other people will help other people to learn something about the practices that they're interested in. So a very interesting example. And essentially this work sort of follows a kind of expansive learning cycle that Ingestrom has given us as a system of learning actions that take place over a period of time, very well constituted, never that linear, but nevertheless it gives you at least ways of working, building learning networks, and these kinds of things is pretty much what has been happening there. And this we've been doing both across different countries in Africa, but also in some context, other contexts, like in the Netherlands, Vietnam, and so on. We've had case studies running there. And trying to find, the first point is to try to find that thing which is of biggest concern to local people, and then find what can be expanded from there, and then how to do that collectively through these expansive learning processes and cycles. So the importance of the starting points has been very vital. We've learned a lot about those and how to make those kind of starts. We're now working with this in the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan of the Presidency, and working with these at-risk value chains. For example, the coal value chain, and what are the alternatives to coal, how to construct alternatives to coal, how to deal with mine workers that are likely to lose their jobs. Is there opportunities for reskilling? What is the system of skill and learning in that context? And we've also been working with this in schools and really trying to deal with this particular challenge in the schools of teaching the children about the problems and not finding ways of helping them to be part of the alternatives. So this is a very nice, simple little project. It's the alternative to footprints. We say alternative to footprint education can be handprint, your action to sustainability. I think this university has been involved in it as well with Matthias, and that it was German funded. I think with Kartikaya from India, we launched it quite a number of years ago, picked up by Rob and the team, handprint for Claire, ongoing activities with children, teachers handbook. So a whole body of work that's also developed to support the teachers and the schools. And you can see the relationship here. Rob's been developing the pedagogical process model to be more aligned and easily useful in schools and school contexts, but still keeping the same commitment to the open process, transformative learning, and the collective the possibility for curriculum activated change projects. In other words, that collective process within the school community context. So a very productive project. Here's one project of John Burkeni, who's also been connecting into to Leuphana here, working with a beautiful project actually in Zimbabwe, which is one of the resettlement schools in Zimbabwe, probably one of the most, I would say, under-resourced kind of environments for education, but still able to do this incredible creative pedagogical work with children, parents, their heritage knowledges, and then expanding their knowledges to develop their critical thinking skills. And you can see here, I won't go through it with you now, but here you can just see this lovely deliberation amongst the children about how to act in their context in relation to their local wildlife communities and so on. So this was John's PhD, and then what is emerging from that. So we've also then been doing this work with teachers, as Daniel said, and teacher educators, because they often are quite neglected, actually, the teacher educators. Who supports the teacher educator to know how to do this kind of work? You support the next generation of teachers. So we've been working with teacher educators and developing this change-orientated action learning program with them, co-defining it, co-developing it. You can see following the same kind of expansive learning type of process, and then settling it around these self-chosen change projects that the teacher educators do with students, with community, with each other, and so on. And here's some examples of them. Here's a sustainable green energy biodigester in one of the colleges of education. Here's integrating ESD into industrial attachment programs, eco offices in Lusaka, Indigenous Botanical Gardens, again in Lesotho's College of Education. This one is growing herbs for the home economics department. This one is working with biosphere reserves to bring Indigenous knowledges into the curriculum. So a range of different change projects that people decide to focus on. And it's really important for people to decide what is the matter of concern, because they know their context and then have the space to know how to expand their learning from there. So there's quite a few insights from all of this work, but the most important one is that we need to create ways that people can be part of reimagining the purpose and practice of education. It can't be done in a top-down way, actually. It can't be done for them, or it can't be done by assessing them. We have to create spaces for this collaborative, open process work. And we should trust our teachers to know how to work with the children and the communities and the context where they are, and then to expand learning from there. I don't think we trust our teachers enough. The other thing is that we should recognize that all of these people have got agency for change. It's so interesting to me that we can build a whole education system on an assumption that people don't have agency for change. It's strange, right? Very strange. And then to understand this agency and what it is and how it unfolds and what is important in the agency process. And then what support the teachers need. We found that teachers still need support for new environmental knowledge because it's complex. They don't always understand it. It comes with big concepts. So we need to support them to be able to use new environmental knowledge in their change projects. We need to definitely support the development of new models of assessment, because the models of assessment are so archaic and they don't nearly touch the kind of thing that one is doing in this kind of learning. So then we thought, well, let's just develop new models of assessment. Why should we be stuck with the old, you know? And then the kinds of just supporting the practices that are necessary. So here's our recent work with our assessment. We kind of very, ambitious here with the assessment work. And we're saying that we need assessment that allows us to flourish. Okay? We don't need assessment that's just constraining us. So we're building a model of assessment that's flourishing, and we're actually using flowers because to share the metaphor, right? Because to share the metaphor gives people a vision, and then they can also be the teachers. We found are actually loving this approach to thinking about assessment, and so it can help the teachers also to get unstuck from this feeling of being so stressed and so on. So we really are keen to work with Daniel and the team on this model. Oh, this thing is just shifting so fast. I don't know what's going on here. Okay, so then just very briefly what we're learning about all of this in our research program. I'm nearly at the end. we're certainly seeing that it's having an impact in the lives of the teachers, the teacher educators, and they're starting to understand the significance of this transformative education, not only for themselves, but also for the schools or communities and the children and the lives. I love this piece from John's thesis, where the teachers are reflecting on, how this curriculum changed, actually what it actually means in the school and the community. And I think it is giving us the practical side of this very ambitious document. We're starting to see, at least some stories that can show us. There's also lots of lessons from the expansive learning project from Engström and colleagues. And, I keep reading the work, because the more I read it, the more I understand the depth actually of the theoretical work. And there's a lot in it actually that I think we can do much more with in the educational sciences. And he's now writing much more about the problem of education in schools and communities. He said it's encapsulated. It's like transferring old knowledge, and it's not giving anybody a chance to actually co-create and build new forms of knowledge. So it's a very big critique actually, and I'm interested in looking at it more carefully, also for our curriculum. I think the most important thing is that if given the chance, right, teachers, children, learners, communities can actually help to see these sustainable futures together. And what's more important is they actually like doing it, which is amazing, actually. So I think there is a possibility to keep up with this work. We've tried to capture what we're learning about these kinds of learning time and time again. We've done this a number of times. Only last year I published it for the first time. So we keep on changing it because we keep learning more about it. That we've and this is helpful because it helps us to be able to see into the kind of learning and be able to recognize it when it's happening in front of us. It's not a definition, it's a kind of process in the making is what we've been working on there. And then also to think about it in terms of education transformation as a whole, right? So learning as acculturation is the model that we were left with and are still left with. What is learning as transgression? It's a different animal, and there's a very nice sort of stretch space in between that we can actually co-creatively craft new ways of thinking about education and learning. So we've also been working a bit with that as a way of like rethinking education, and then again, populating this policy intention. So here's the last slide, and it's the ongoing challenge. And it's one for all of us, actually. So how do we more strongly and clearly bring collective transformative learning processes into education to extend, complement, and or challenge some aspects of the current dominant culture? I think that is the challenge that we all face. And I think if we start to look, we'll find so much innovation, but if we can have a way of capturing that, describing it, sharing it, I think we'll be able to do a lot more with what we're trying to do. So there's the reference. And the reference, just to explain what it is, I last year for the first time managed to write a paper on T-learning and to bring together the archive of work that we've been able to build up over the last 10 years. So all of the references on the reference list, I just wanted one thing where all the references could be found. And there you'll be able to see also how people from other parts of the world are starting to dialogue with the core bodies of work. You'll be able to see the student work, references to their theses and so on. So you can actually find the full story of this project so far. There's still a lot more that we can do with it, but at least that's one thing that we managed to do. So thank you very much.